I'm Stephen Cohen. I'm responsible for special projects at the Merowith Center, and I am so happy to be able to introduce Father Dominic Garamoni to all of you. Father Dominic is a monk at St. Bede's Abbey in Peru, Illinois. He's the head of the religious department at St. Bede, and he teaches world religions and sacraments. He's also the drama director of the school and has published 2 plays. Most of us, though, know him as from his being the host of the PBS cooking show Breaking Bread with Father Dominic from 1999 to 2001, and he is also the author of 10 cookbooks. His children's book, Brother Jerome and the Angels in the Bakery, was the recipient of the 2011 Christopher Award for Children's Books, ages 8 to 10, and the 2011 Catholic Press Association First Place Award for Children's Books. With his televised program, while his program is no longer airing, the Bread Monk can still be seen on occasional PBS pledge drives, as well as a baking instructor on Blueprint.com. He travels throughout the state giving lively and entertaining bread demonstrations to civic and religious groups. Father Dom says he got his culinary education between my mother's kitchen, PBS, and the public library. And when he's not baking or teaching, he can usually be found in the Abbey Herb Garden. Father, thank you so much for joining us. We're so looking forward to your presentation.
I'm delighted to be with you. I'm happy that this technology makes this possible because I've been craving talking about bread. I mean, normally I have 3 or 4 of these kinds of presentations in a month, and I haven't had an opportunity to do this kind of sharing very much. I want to interrupt just for a moment and say, Michael Zinberg, uh, my beard used to be that color. I'm just warning that may be in your future. When I had my TV show, I had a beard that was colors, and that's an admirable looking beard. So yeah, this may be your future right here. I'm just warning. So I got asked to do something about holiday baking, and I'm going to do a little PowerPoint. And during the PowerPoint, I will go to share screen, which means that I won't be able to see any of you. But Judith is going to keep an eye and see if anybody has a question, either through chat or live, if you would get her attention. And if you want to ask a question about what I'm talking about at that exact moment, and you'd rather not wait till the end, then please feel free to interrupt. I teach high school. I'm used to people waving their hands in the air and stopping me in the middle of a lecture. So, and I tell my students they should do that, as long as they do so politely. It's a little different in Zoom, of course. But if at any point during the program you have a question about something that has to do with baking in general, or about a specific recipe, or something that I'm talking about on the screen at that moment, please feel free to ask your questions. But we'll also take time for questions later on at the end of the program. If you have specific questions about holiday baking in general or bread making in particular, I may be able to assist you or at least direct you to where you can find the answer. Anybody have any questions to begin with? Every good teacher does that. Does anybody have a question to start?
Father, I think also you want to mention that you were going to share some recipes that we can send out.
Yes, thank you. Those of you who have registered for the program, after this program is over, the recipes that I have reviewed during the presentation will be links to those recipes online will be sent to you via email. And so, so you'll be able to find those recipes online and print them out for yourself. So the recipes that you're being seen, don't feel like you have to take notes, or if I don't give amounts, that's problematic. The recipes will be shared with you after the program. But as I have sometimes commented, I don't like to give out recipes during a presentation because it's like people will read the bulletin during the sermon. I would prefer that people are, engaged in the presentation, and we'll give you the recipes later. And it will also include a link to my website, which is where the recipes are, but then there's also a way to contact me through the website if you have additional questions afterwards. The last presentation I did, there were a couple of recipes that I had mentioned in the program, but had not shared the recipes with, and people had specifically asked for them, and so I was happy to share those recipes with them as well. So It will also include the file that I send you, or the document, will also have a link to our monastery's retail website where you can get my cookbooks and other Abbey products and things like that, in case you're interested in adding to your cookbook collection. My mother, well, when she passed away, God rest her soul, there were 8, not exaggerating, 8 Xerox boxes filled with just the bread books. Just the bread books. I mean, that doesn't even include the cookie books and the other general cookbooks and so forth. The bread books alone, 8 boxes. And of course, my siblings were like, yeah, those are goes. You deal with them. Do they box them up and they ship them to me? You deal with these. So I have quite the library, let me tell you. If you got a question about a recipe, chances are I got it somewhere. So. All right, I'm going to go to share screen and show you the presentation. We're going to talk about 3 different holidays to bake for. Specifically, we're going to talk about Hanukkah and Kwanzaa, and then a number of Christmas recipes as well. So let's go to share screen. There we go. Now, I'm going to warn you in advance. Make sure that some of you were perhaps expecting me to look like this, which is how I have looked most recently on television, instead of looking like this. But that is because in about 2 weeks, I'm going to look like this, okay? Because I'm playing Santa for a video and then doing some live events as well. Now, I'm sorry, I'm disappointed that this year I won't be able to play St. Nicholas either. I have a whole St. Nicholas costume that I usually do a program on St. Nicholas as well. But this is what I'm headed for, is to me to play Father Christmas. So that's why the beard is so bushy these days. So I want to talk first about Hanukkah jelly donuts. You're probably familiar with this tradition if you come from a Jewish background. Others may be less familiar with it. They're called sufganiyot, and they are a very, very popular treat during Hanukkah. But I want to talk about the background to the Hanukkah celebration. For those of you who are not familiar, some of you will be, some will not, but just because I teach comparative religions, I teach world religions, I already had these slides. So I thought, let's just go ahead and share through it, okay? Hanukkah is, of course, the Festival of Lights. It's an 8-night festival. It celebrates the rededication of the temple following its recapture from an invading army under Antiochus IV, who was trying to impose Greek culture on the Jewish people, including religion, okay? Judas Maccabeus rose up in a revolt with him and his family, his sons, as is recounted in the book of Maccabees. And after having reconquered the country, they rededicated the temple, which had been defiled by the pagan gods, and they lit the 7-branched lampstand and resumed worship. However, because it was a period of war, they did not have much of a supply of oil. And so they only had enough oil for a single night for it to burn for a single night. But miraculously, the oil lasted for 8 nights. And so that's why this celebration is a celebration of lights, and why you use the lighting of the menorah is the primary symbol or ritual that is associated with Hanukkah. Also, of course, the dreidel game is another part of the festival as well. I will say that I actually play the dreidel game with my students every year. I think we use M&Ms or Skittles, depending upon. We didn't play this year because of the COVID business, but usually we do play the dreidel game. Now, it is traditional to use foods fried in oil because because this festival itself is the miracle of the oil. And so latkes are one of the most popular foods during this time, which is a potato pancake made with scallions and herbs and sometimes cheese, depending upon how much kosher you're observing. But those are fried in oil, and those really, that you can smell a house where they're frying latkes, that's for sure. The other thing that's made, though, are these sufganiyot, which is a jelly donut. Now, the whole history of fried pastries like this is kind of complex, and the whole idea of a Hanukkah jelly donut is relatively recent. And when I say relatively, because it wasn't possible until sugar became a common commodity, which of course wasn't until the development of the slave trade, the molasses to rum to slaves, that whole business. So it has kind of an unfortunate history. But when sugar became a less expensive commodity, it made it possible to make more of these kinds of treats. Also, there was an economic reason behind it because they wanted to promote the Jewish bakeries throughout the world, but especially in the Holy Land. And so this was a treat that everybody could enjoy during Hanukkah. Now, there's one piece of kitchen equipment that you must have to make sufganiyot, and one piece of kitchen equipment that makes things easier, okay? The first thing you have to have is a fryer. Now, you don't need a giant fryer like this. I happen to have one, of course, because we have a monastery that runs a high school. So I've got a big fryer like this. This one is actually in Jerusalem. You can use just an ordinary stock pot to make your jelly donuts. You can make use of one of these enamel ones, those Le Croisette things, kind of a Dutch oven sort of thing on a stovetop can be used as well. Here's somebody who's making them in a big, deep cast iron skillet. That's a good choice as well. Whatever you use, you're going to want to make sure that you have a thermometer, a candy thermometer that you can immerse in it and make sure the oil stays at the right temperature. And that can be a little bit tricky, especially on an electric stove. That's why I tend to use an electric fryer, which has a temperature control on it, so I can set it at that temperature and kind of leave it, and it will self-regulate. This is a Fry Daddy here. Better still is one of these, like this is actually the model I have, this Presto electric griddle. The only problem with it, electric skillet, the only problem with this particular model, it was a gift to me, is it doesn't have temperatures on it. It has numbers, and so you have to know that 4.5 is the right temperature for frying these jelly donuts. It requires a certain amount of experimentation. Having one of those immersible candy thermometers is pretty useful that clips to the side. Like I said, I set my dial at 4.5 to begin with, and that seemed to do the job, but your model may be different. The other thing you're going to want to have is something to put the filling inside the donuts. Now, one of the easiest things you can use is an ordinary squirt bottle with a skinny spout on it like that. Works beautifully, and that's in fact what I used most recently. Of course, they make various kinds of pastry bags with special tips on the end that you can use. The ones that are used, this one right here I'm showing you right now is actually used specifically for jelly donuts. However, they make this one, which is primarily for filling cupcakes. That I got mine at Walmart. I don't think it was $3, and it includes 2 disposable pastry bags with it as well. So that's kind of a nice entry-level sort of thing. It doesn't cost very much, fairly easy to find, and works fairly well. I used it actually most recently to fill cream puffs. I made cream puffs that were filled, that had the same flavor profile as tiramisu. The cream on the inside was a coffee flavored cream with a chocolate ganache over the top. The monks were spoiled. I'm just going to name it. Monks are spoiled. So you'll need something to put filling in the donuts. Now, sufganiyot dough is very, very wet. Okay, it is not like other kinds of dough. It's not even like many other jelly donut doughs are not quite as wet as this, at least a lot of the ones that I have seen. And so if you follow the recipe that I send you, the recipe I'm going to send you, the link I'm going to send you is actually to a website by a baker named Tori Avey, who is a Jewish gal who does wonderful, wonderful baking. And she has really done her homework in creating a recipe that is authentic and at the same time accessible for the average person. So I think you'll really enjoy exploring her whole website in terms of cooking, and some of you may already be familiar with her. One of the things that she says, and which is a little different, I just made biscuits today, as a matter of fact, because we're going to have chicken and biscuits for supper. And so I made biscuits this morning, this afternoon. And when you make biscuits and you use the cutter, you want to push straight down and not twist back and forth too much, because you don't want to seal the edges. You want those edges to be loose so that you can get a big fluffy layered biscuit. With sufganiyot, you twist it back and forth to seal the edges slightly, because then you get that beautiful rounded jelly donut look. Okay, So it's just a little thing of technique that she mentions in her website, and which was absolutely accurate and gave me great results. She recommends that you use a temperature of 325 to 340. A lot of recipes will say all the way up to 350 or even 375. Her experience is that with this particular dough that she uses is that they get dark on the outside and they're done in the middle when you use that higher temperature. Anything below 325, things are going to get oily. They're going to start soaking up the oil. This seems to be just about perfect. 90 seconds per side, and I put the timer on my phone, and it was exactly perfect every single time. So this is a really reliable recipe and really worth making. You're going to drain them on paper towels and let them cool. Now, one of the things I want to notice here, I'll use my little pointer. Notice these kind of striations in the dough. Okay, as it poofs up in the oil, you get these kind of stretch marks, as it were. That's because the top of the donut, the top of the dough dries out just a little bit. And when you put it into the oil, when it stretches, it tends to break up like that. There's nothing wrong with that. It's purely cosmetic. There's nothing bad about that, because you're going to cover it with powdered sugar or icing anyway. So don't let that bother you. And in fact, the slightly dried out top makes for that beautiful rounded sort of look. And I think it's an ideal recipe. It's absolutely perfect as far as I'm concerned. Now, she also suggested that you fill them from the top, because that's the traditional way for sufganyon. If you're going to make pashki in the Polish tradition, you make the filling on the side. She suggested taking an ordinary drinking straw and putting a hole in and opening it up slightly before you put the filling in, and I think that works rather nicely. You put your squeeze bottle in there and you start to squeeze, and it will start to squirt out the top, and that's how you know that there's a sufficient amount in there. It's really only about a tablespoon. It's not a huge amount of jelly. These are fairly small. One of the things I like about traditional sufganyon is that you don't feel bad after you've eaten one. A lot of these jelly donuts that you buy at a big the donut shop of some kind, they're huge. It feels like you've eaten a catcher's mitt, and so they're just so big, and you feel guilty having eaten it. These are just the right size. They're just 3 bites and you're done. And I find them just absolutely delightful. And so did the brethren, let me tell you. They did not last very long at the supper table. As you can see, they're traditionally sprinkled with powdered sugar. Now, as far as the filling is concerned, you can use chocolate, you can use strawberry, you can use raspberry. She recommends that when you use something like strawberry jam or strawberry preserves or strawberry jam or raspberry, that you run it through a sieve to screen out all the seeds, so you're not chewing on the seeds and the filling is perfectly smooth. I find that sometimes jelly is almost too sweet for me, or jam is too sweet for me. I actually used strawberry pie filling and ran it through the food processor until it was perfectly smooth. And then there were no seeds involved, and it's not quite as sweet as jam or preserves or jelly. And you might like that better. I found that I preferred it because it wasn't quite so sweet. And as a diabetic, I felt a little better about having one. Okay. I've never seen anybody use like a sugar-free filling of any kind. I'm not really sure. Very often people use chocolate, they use prune, they use apricot. There's all kinds of different flavors that can go in there. But these take a long time because the first rise is almost 2 hours. It's a yeasted dough that takes almost 2 hours to rise for the first time and another 45 minutes the second time. So it does require a significant amount of investment of time, but totally worth it as far as I'm concerned. So, all right, I'm going to stop at that point because we're at the end of the jelly donut thing. Are there specific questions that people have about this process or this recipe? I see we have some chat things there. I don't know if those are related to this or not.
We do. There's how are you baking? Ellen Boone asks, how are you baking soda? How are baking soda and baking powder different in how they interact with ingredients? And how can baking powder be used instead of baking soda in an effort to lower sodium in the final product? That was Ellen Boone.
Okay, Well, first off, if you're attempting to lower sodium, a better way to do that is by lowering the amount of salt in a recipe. One of the problems with baking soda and baking powder itself and baking soda are necessary for the leavening. They are what make things rise. And so if you start to lessen that, then I'm not sure how there's sodium involved in them chemically. I can tell you that this baking soda interacts with acid things and begins to work immediately. Baking powder is activated by heat and does not begin to work until it goes into the oven or onto the griddle. So for example, pancakes make with baking soda that have, say, that are made with sourdough or that have buttermilk in them, you'll see the batter start to bubble up right away because that begins immediately. Baking powder things do not begin to rise until they're heat activated. And so baking powder pancakes, for example, the batter doesn't seem as thick or as fluffy until you get it onto the griddle. I have a tendency not to play around too much with baking powder, baking soda, but I will give you a rule of thumb, okay? A teaspoon of baking powder basically raises a single cup of flour. So when you look at your recipe and you see 2 cups of flour and it says 2 teaspoons of baking powder, then that's a correct proportion. But if it's telling you any more than that, unless it's a very heavy recipe with lots of eggs and lots of sugar and lots of butter, it may not need extra. Same thing with baking soda. Baking soda is activated with just a 1/4 teaspoon per cup of flour. And so a lot of recipes have way more baking soda than is necessary, it seems to me. And that can give it kind of a metallic or chemical taste to it. So I have a tendency to look carefully at a recipe and make sure that the proportions are right. There's a really excellent book out there called Cookwise and another one called Bakewise, both of them by Shirley Corriher. I'll try to remember to put that in the document, which give you the actual kind of biochemical action of those substances and how they're used and can be interchanged. There are some really good articles online with that same subject matter as well, but the two are not really too much interchangeable unless the recipe has a sufficient amount of acid to activate the baking soda. That's why a lot of baking soda biscuits use buttermilk, because there's some acid in the buttermilk, or you might add cream of tartar, which is also an acidifying agent. You might add cream of tartar to a recipe if you're using baking soda. My biscuit recipe does that, for example. So.
And then we have from Leslie Jacobson and also Diane Merritt. They have a question about air fryers. What do you think of air fryers? And does, from Mary, can you air fry or bake these? So.
Well, one of the things, first off, the whole point is that they're fried in oil because of the miracle of the oil for Hanukkah. So if you're making them for Hanukkah, oil is kind of the point. It's almost like a spiritual thing. However, I have seen recipes for air fryer jelly donuts. I don't know if they really count as sufganiyot, but I have seen recipes for air fryer donuts. Now, I have never used an air fryer. We don't have one in the monastery. I have a friend who keeps telling me he wants to buy me one. But we don't have one in the monastery, and we don't eat a lot of fried foods anyway, simply because our diet just isn't like that. So I don't really have any opinion about air fryers presently. I do know that some people use them for some of these kinds of things, but I don't have experience.
Then we have another question. Does baking soda or baking powder get old in the cupboard? From Diane.
Absolutely. Yeah, you never want to keep it more than a year. It usually has an expiration date on it. It usually has an expiration date on it. And that, yeah, I always check mine. Of course, we're cooking for, nearly 300 students plus faculty, plus the monks. And so we tend to go through things pretty quickly. And I do enough baking myself that a pound of yeast will last me maybe a month. I buy it by the pound as opposed to by the package. So that, but those things expire. All of those leavening agents like baking powder, baking soda, and yeast all have an expiration date on them. You want to make sure you keep an eye on that and don't frustrate yourself by creating this recipe with all these butter and eggs and sugar and so forth, and then it comes out flat because your baking powder, baking soda hasn't been activated.
And then I have one last question before you move on. Diane Packin wants to know, can you use any flavor for your pie filling? Pie
Absolutely.
filling?
Yes, I have seen these done with blueberry. I have any flavor. The most popular ones in Israel are strawberry and apricot, and chocolate now. Chocolate has kind of supplanted the others. And you can do a chocolate cream sort of filling. Now, if you want to make a really easy chocolate cream recipe for filling for things, especially for cream puffs, I find, or banana cream for that matter, I find that if you take ordinary instant pudding, either chocolate or banana or whatever flavor, and make it with half as much milk. So let's suppose the recipe calls for 2 cups of milk. You use 1 cup of milk with the same amount of the packaged ingredients for the instant pudding. And then, so you've got this kind of concentrated pudding. And then you make real whipped cream, with heavy cream and a touch of salt and a little bit of powdered sugar. And then you fold the two together and you get the intense flavor from the pudding, slightly thicker and creamier because of the pudding, but then the lightness of the whipped cream as well. And that makes an excellent filling for just about anything. So if you want to go with a chocolate filling, I would do that. You use your chocolate pudding, just half as much milk, and then put an equal amount of whipped cream in it, homemade whipped cream. I suppose you it's cool, but if you're going to go to the trouble of making homemade donuts, I'd want to use cream. I mean, it's for the holidays. You want to splurge.
And that's all the questions I think for right now. Oh,
Okay.
wait a minute. So Linda Spitzer-Gaventon would like to know if you want to substitute baking powder for baking soda. A good rule of thumb is 3 to 4 times the amount. So if the recipe calls for a half a teaspoon of baking soda, use 2 teaspoons of baking powder. But in cookies, for instance, they will be more puffy rather than spread out.
They will have a tendency to be cakier. Yeah. I like I said, it's easier to substitute baking powder for baking soda than the other way around. But that depends upon what the recipe is as well. Some recipes won't work at all without baking soda itself because of the acid in it. Some baking powder recipes won't work with baking soda because the baking soda doesn't have any acid to work on. So I have a tendency to keep both around just in case, and they're easy to store. So they don't really need to be refrigerated. Some people do refrigerate them, but that will not extend their life anymore as a leavening agent. Okay, let's move on to the next recipe. And one more good close-up look at the jelly donut. I really enjoyed making these, and although I don't know if you have this same pet peeve or not. Those of you who go online and go on Pinterest or go on websites and look at recipes, does it tick you off like it does me that like I have to wade through 16 pictures of the exact same cookie from 8 different angles in order to get to the recipe? I find that so annoying, where it's like, all right, lady, I know you set up your whole beautiful set and you've got your light box and you've got your kitchen all nice and everything, but I only need to see 2 pictures of the cookie and then just give me the recipe. Okay, I really don't need all the photos. That's just one of my pet peeves, just saying that. So, Kwanzaa, fruited sweet potato bread. Now, sweet potatoes are traditionally served for Kwanzaa, and were very popular among African Americans because they were similar to the yams that they had in Africa. The closest thing that they had were the sweet potato you find in the United States. And so very often these are served obviously at Thanksgiving, at other holidays in the United States, but these are also served as part of Kwanzaa service. And so either you can make the fruited sweet potato bread, so you have that as part of your Kwanzaa table, or you can use the leftovers of the mashed sweet potatoes, or even just cooked sweet potatoes, and turn them into this potato bread. Now, Kwanzaa is a relatively new holiday, although it has ancient origins. It was developed in 1966 by Maulana Karenga, and he wanted a holiday to kind of unite and empower Black people, especially after the Watts riots. And so he created, I mean, no one has pretended this is an ancient thing. It's just that he created it from these ancient rituals and called it Kwanzaa because that phrase in Swahili means first fruits. The reason it got an additional A on the end is because Kwanzaa in the original language has 6 letters, and the first celebration they had 7 children involved in the celebration, and they wanted to have a letter for each child, and so they added a letter to the word so that they could kind of involve the group in a particular way, which I think is a really very charming story of the origins. I suspect that there are probably variations in the dialect where there's 2 A's in it anyway, but nonetheless, it is a holiday which has these ancient origins as a festival for celebrating the first fruits, or a harvest festival, but which then was adapted in order to help people to celebrate their cultural heritage. Now, it is a cultural holiday rather than a religious one. Most people celebrate, and many people who celebrate Kwanzaa also celebrate Christmas or some other ethnic holiday. So it is meant to be a cultural holiday rather than a religious one, and is not meant to replace necessarily any other festival. Get this to move on here. Oh, here we go. Kwanzaa settles around 7 different principles, which are represented by the 7 candles, each of which are lit on successive nights. Unity, self-determination, collective work and responsibility, cooperative economics, purpose, creativity, and faith. Obviously, real positive values that would be a good part of pretty much any culture. So you can see that this has really got some positive aspects and some opportunities for education and edification of children, and the unity of families as well. Now, every time I make this recipe, it amazes me that there are so many ingredients. It's like if you've ever made gingerbread. Gingerbread has like 1,000 recipes, 1,000 ingredients in tiny, tiny amounts. This one has a lot of them as well, but it is a harvest festival after all. And that's why I developed this with as many different fruits as possible. So over here, we're looking at the sweet potatoes, and those were simply in a can, okay? You can use canned, you can use fresh mashed, you can use leftover mashed. Any one of those are going to work for this recipe. Ordinary all-purpose flour, sugar. This is chopped walnuts here, and I like them chopped not too fine. I like them some bigger chunks. These are dark raisins. This is orange juice here, butter. This is homemade applesauce. Now, you can use canned applesauce, sweetened or unsweetened. I myself, we have an apple orchard here at the monastery, and so I put up a lot of applesauce, and that's what I used for my recipe here. This is the spices here, which are kind of like the same spices that go into pumpkin pie, baking powder and salt, and then a couple of eggs are the ingredients in this particular recipe. Okay, and again, you'll get the recipe in those amounts with directions. You're going to mix your wet ingredients together first, and then your dry ingredients. You're going to leave the raisins and the walnuts out. You're going to mix the two together almost all the way through, and then at the very end, before everything is completely mixed, you fold in the walnuts and the raisins, and that completes the mixing process, but doesn't overbeat the mixture such that you get kind of a tough, you don't want to develop the gluten in this particular recipe. You want to do it to keep it tender. Now, you can make this as a gluten-free recipe, but I suspect there'd be some adaptations you'd have to make, and I don't know quite what they are. I have not made this as gluten-free yet. I have made gluten-free pumpkin donuts and gluten-free pumpkin scones, but I have not made this yet as a gluten-free recipe. So they may need some adaptations that I'm not aware of. I like to make it in these smaller pans. You can make it in 1 or 2 larger pans, a 9x5 or 2 8.5 by 2.5 by 4.5 standard loaf pans. But I like it in these smaller increments because then you can gift them. And since many of these celebrations, Kwanzaa and others, there's plenty of food on the table. It's not like you're going to run out of food. So having a smaller amount where people take a smaller portion, I think is kind of a nice alternative. It does make the house smell absolutely magnificent. So I do recommend this recipe to you. And it is not difficult, it can be done within about an hour. You can have this recipe finished, and so it's a nice treat to be able to create. Okay, there it is laid out with some butter in the center there. I put this out for the brethren about a week before Thanksgiving, and it was devoured within a day, all 4 loaves. So so I decided that this was a recipe worth keeping. And I have made this obviously many times before this, but I hadn't made it in a couple of years. And so when I put it out again, they were like, "Is this that one sweet potato thing?" I'm like, "Yeah," and they remembered it and enjoyed it. I do like to soften the butter ahead of time and whip it up a little bit. As you can see, I've done here, I've kind of whipped the butter up a little bit, softened it, and whipped it slightly, so that when you put it out, it spreads easily on the dough. Having cold butter on top of a piece of bread sometimes can produce tears that can be frustrating. So, any questions about this recipe or other quick bread recipes that you are familiar with that you maybe have questions about or are wondering about? Or anybody about gluten-free baking? I know a little bit about that, not a great deal, but some.
Father John, Linda asks, she wants to put up the screen again that had the 7 attributes for Kwanzaa.
Oh yeah, sure, I can back that up. Right there. Yeah, that is not on the handout you're going to get. There are some really very nice websites and short videos that are available online that instruct people about Kwanzaa, some of which are developed for children, some of which are for adults that are more historical. But I do find there's a lot of good material out there. And much to my delight, some absolutely magnificent pictures. Some people have taken some beautiful photos, because one of the things, like a Thanksgiving table, where you kind of decorate with the fruits of the harvest, a Kwanzaa celebration does that same thing. And in fact, there's a tradition that certain things have to be on the Kwanzaa table. I didn't want to get into those details, but there are certain foods that are put out on the Kwanzaa table kind of as a symbolic. So they make these beautiful displays with candles and so on. Really quite lovely. That's worth investigating online. It's just a part of the culture I was not familiar with at all. Ready to move on?
I think so. I'm not seeing any more.
Okay. So let's look at some Christmas showpieces. This is obviously where I have spent a lot of time in developing recipes. I get asked to do Christmas specials for PBS stations, and then I had a Christmas book that just came out last year, a Christmas recipe book that came out just last year. What we're looking at here is actually a king cake for the end of the Christmas season on Epiphany, but we'll get to that. Oh, by the way, I'm sorry I don't have a picture up here. I wish I would have thought of it. This Sunday is the Feast of St. Nick, and it is a traditional day for the serving of a cookie called spekulas. And if you've never had spekulas homemade before, you really ought to try it. And on my website, there is a blog post with these St. Nicholas cookies on them. They're called spekulas. And they're just absolutely, as far as I'm concerned, the best spice cookie on the planet. I could eat them like potato chips. I have a special mold that's shaped like St. Nicholas. You can use other cookie cutters, however, to make these as well. There's also a website, stnicholascenter.org, also mentioned on my website, in which you can find all kinds of information about how St. Nicholas's feast day is celebrated all over the world with lots and lots of children. If you would remember me, Judith, I will put that link also on that document because if you are on Facebook, you can follow. I have a Facebook page for me as the Bread Monk, Father Dominic the Bread Monk, and I just posted today a link to my website with all that information. So if you're on Facebook and you want to follow me on Facebook, I just did a post about St. Nicholas Day there, which included a picture of me as St. Nicholas, by the way, in case you're wondering what that looks like. One of the nice things about living in a monastery is that when you need to play a bishop, you've got plenty of props. You know, we didn't have any trouble costuming that one. So One of my favorite recipes to make for the community is this almond spiral. It's made with a basic sweet dough, but it's got kind of a specific technique for it. It uses solo almond filling, not almond paste, almond filling. And it's the Solo brand, makes the very best one out there. Really quite delicious. I don't recommend anything else, including homemade. It is just absolutely. So there it is right there. You can see what the can looks like. You roll your dough out as if you're going to make cinnamon rolls. Okay? Then you spread this on. Sometimes help to warm the spread up just a little bit. It's kind of sticky. And so I tend to put it in some warm water for a little while. So it warms up, we can get it out of the can and put it into the microwave. You roll the dough up, roll the dough out, and put the spread on and roll it up as if you are going to make cinnamon rolls. But the next step is quite different. What you do is you cut it down the middle. Okay, so you cut it lengthwise, so you get essentially 2 half pipes. You get 2 half pipes. And as you can see, I did not cut them perfectly even, and that will not hurt at all. You don't roll out your dough perfectly even, and you don't cut it evenly, and it's not going to ruin anything. So you start by simply making a spiral, and then you connect the second one and make a second spiral. It looks fairly small now, but when it rises and spreads out, it becomes quite large. And so here's a finished one here. That's a 16-inch pizza pan, by the way. So this is a pretty big coffee cake. Don't be fooled. That's not a little 10-inch pan. That's a great big one. And then you put a little powdered sugar drizzle over the top and some toasted almonds. And it really makes a beautiful display. This one, I used actual icing, not a glaze, but an icing, and then the toasted almonds. And then you can also make it with cinnamon sugar filling and toasted pecans with a frosting over the light glaze or frosting over the top. This is really nice because it's one of those things that, because it's in these layers, you kind of pick at it, you know, like you leave it out on the counter and everybody peels a little piece off, and then you walk by and you peel another little piece off, and you got a cup of coffee, you cut another little piece off. And so it's kind of thing you sort of snack on throughout the course of a day or a couple of days. It makes a beautiful showpiece, obviously, and you can make it a size that will fit exactly in one of those baskets that a fruit basket comes in from the store. Sometimes people buy a fruit basket for Christmas, send it to your family, and then the basket's left, you don't know what to do with it. You can put a dozen rolls or one of these coffee cakes in there, and it makes a nice little gift. Now, that same technique is used to make chocolate babka. Now, I'm a huge fan of babka. Now, in this particular case, I decided that I was going to roll them separately. So I rolled them out and then spread the chocolate filling. You can use a homemade chocolate filling. You can use a Hershey's chocolate spread. You can use a hazelnut spread. Jif makes a salted caramel chocolate spread that will put an indelible mark on your soul. It is absolutely delicious and makes a wonderful, wonderful filling for a babka or chocolate cinnamon rolls or any of those kinds of things. So I really recommend it. Notice I'm using an offset knife. If you have an offset spreader spatula like that, use it. And if you don't, they're not very expensive. You find them in the cake section of any big department store like a Walmart or Target and so forth. Those are really handy when you're putting out a spread on these kinds of filled coffee cakes. So the two rolls are twisted together, or you can do it on the left-hand side. I did the exact same technique as you saw on the almond spiral, where I made one big long log, cut it in half, and then twisted the two together to get this beautiful spiral on the left. And you can see the layers and layers of chocolate on the inside. I think that if you're serving sweetened coffee or sweetened tea, you do not need to put a glaze or powdered sugar or a frosting of any kind on this. You want to kind of appreciate the delicateness of the chocolate filling. But some people kind of want to go over the top and they'll put a glaze or they'll put a ganache over the top or something. I don't think it really needs it. You might want to try it without first before you go to that level. Traditionally, babka does not have nuts in it, although sometimes it is made with a streusel, when you make a cinnamon babka. So a cinnamon babka can be served this side up as it is on the left, or the bunt side with a streusel on it as well. They're traditionally made in a bunt pan, which were, in case you didn't know this, bunt pans are a relatively late invention. They were invented in this country, in the United States, in the 1940s and 50s because they were trying to replace the kind of pan that was made in Poland and Eastern Europe for various breads that were supposed to represent like a grandmother's fluted petticoats, okay, or fluted skirts. And so there weren't such things in the United States. And so the Nordic ware actually developed this form of pan. They got a request from these various women, and that became a popular part of people's kitchens in the 1940s and 50s, but really took off in 1964 when somebody won the Pillsbury Bake Off with a bundt cake. Okay, and then all of a sudden, everybody started buying bundt pans. But until the 1960s, they were not found commonly in everybody's kitchen. They're a fairly late development. How many people, I don't know if people remember getting tunnel of fudge. Do you remember that recipe? Tunnel of fudge was a common cake in the 1960s and 70s. I see a couple of people shaking their heads. My mom made that for birthdays. We just absolutely loved it. They don't make the frosting mix anymore that you use for it, but there is a retro engineered recipe online that you can find and that will tell you how to make it from scratch. And that's another great recipe to go in a bundt pan. Okay, I'm going to stop.
I have a question about can these treats be made with stevia instead of sugar?
I've never baked with stevia. I only use stevia in tea or coffee, and so I don't know about stevia baking. I'm not real familiar with it. My tendency is not to substitute sugars because sugar functions in a very specific way chemically in the recipe, not just in terms of sweetening, but also in terms of texture and the way things rise and so forth. And so I tend not to mess with that a whole lot. I'm more likely to say, I'm going to make the traditional recipe and eat a tiny sliver rather than try to substitute out the different sugars. Now, I understand that some people do have to do that for dietary reasons, but I myself have never done that. I can tell you stevia will not feed the yeast. Remember that the yeast is a microorganism that feeds on sugars and starches, and that stevia and other substitutes like it, even the ones that are baking stable, will not feed the yeast, and so the yeast may not grow or rise the way it's supposed to if you use a sugar substitute. So I have a tendency not to substitute those things. There are probably versions of this recipe out there that do make use of that, but I'm not familiar with them personally.
Also, Eunice Bregman would like to know, I think the answer is yes, but will we get the babka recipe and also the sweet bread dough recipe?
Yes, the links that are the link that I'll give you to my website. On my website, at the top navigation bar is the word recipes. You click on that, and there's a drop-down menu, and you'll be able to find the recipes that we're referring to. Will all be on my website. You can click on it, find a single page with just that recipe, and print it out. So yes, babka is definitely on. That was one of the ones that somebody asked me about the last time I gave this presentation, and I made sure it was online. Okay, so yes, it is available to you, both in the cinnamon and chocolate version. For those of you who are familiar with Blueprint, which what used to be Craftsy, I'm an online teacher for that. I have a course on challah and other kinds of baking, and babka is one of the things that I make in that video as well. I haven't yet made a video for YouTube for that, but I suspect eventually that's going to happen as well. I do have a YouTube channel because I am a 21st century monk. So some of these things are you're going to be able to find on YouTube. Okay. Now, hoska is an absolutely wonderful recipe. It's an Eastern European thing, and I have several different versions of recipes from it, some of which were sent to me by viewers of the TV show who just loved this recipe so much they wanted to make sure I had their grandma's version, which I thought was just delightful. I'm always charmed by that. This is designed to use dried fruit like many Christmas breads are, or fruit cake and so forth. I myself am not fond of the flavors of the fruitcake fruits because of the rind, the candied rind that's in there. I am much more fond of dried candied pineapple. I think candied pineapple is maybe a little more acceptable flavor to more people. So I tend to use that along with candied cherries for these kind of fruited breads, or just golden raisins. I'm more likely to use. So whenever you see a recipe like for Stollen or Hoska or any of these recipes, if you don't like the flavor of those particular dried fruits, you can substitute other things and still get a good result because they're not essential to the actual rising of the thing. They're just about the flavoring. So every region has their own version of these kinds of things. Now, about braiding, a little bit about braiding. A lot of people have trouble braiding loaves because they have a hard time rolling the dough out into even ropes. So I'm going to recommend what we call a slab braid. Now, I'm not sure. I think I invented this. I have never seen this anywhere else. And I remember doing it the first time and I'm thinking, did I read this somewhere or did I just make this up in the kitchen? You can actually roll the dough out in an oval. You can, if it's soft enough dough, you can pat it out with your hands without a rolling pin. You don't have a rolling pin, you can use a wine bottle. But you roll it into an oval and then you simply take a pizza cutter, an ordinary pizza cutter, and you cut the 3 strips with just 2 cuts equally apart, leaving it connected at the top, and then you braid the loaf. And the finished product, oh, I didn't have a finished product there, but the finished product is a beautiful braided loaf, okay? So this is called a slab braid. I do have a video about slab braids on my YouTube channel. So if you go there, look for Father Dominic the Bread Monk. I have a 1-minute video on how to do a slab braid, and you can see how it's done there. But it's really very simple. You can just roll the dough out in an oval and cut your 2 strips into it, 3 strips with 2 cuts, and then braid it, and you get a beautiful loaf. It makes you look like, seriously, it makes you look like a pastry chef. So definitely worth getting into. Definitely worth attempting that next time you've got an ordinary loaf of bread you want to dress up a little bit. Now, Stollen is a recipe that comes in 2 different forms. There's a yeasted Stollen that looks very much like the Hoska we just saw, that is usually braided. And again, it's a rich dough. It takes a very long time to rise because there's so much sugar and so many eggs in it, a lot of butter and so forth. There's a faster recipe that's called a biscuit Stollen, and that's what this one is right here, or a Dresden Stollen. And it's made with a dough that's very much like a biscuit dough with baking powder. What's common to both of them is that they have a folded over shape. You make an oval out of the dough by patting it with your hands or rolling it out. You brush some butter on the top of the dough, and then you fold it over part way. And that look is supposed to be, the idea of that is that you are wrapping the baby Jesus in the swaddling clothes. Okay, that's the symbolism of that, is wrapping baby Jesus into the swaddling clothes. And I have a friend, she's passed away now, but she wrote me and she said, my mother would always make Stollen and I was allowed to be the one to fold it over. And my mother always told me to whisper all of my hopes and prayers and dreams for the coming year, and then wrap them up with the baby Jesus. That as you folded it over, you folded your dreams and hopes and wishes for the coming year in with the bread. And that was part of the tradition for her. This one has the filling on the inside of these fruits, and then I also decorated the top with the fruits along with the drizzled icing just to give it a little extra color. But as I said, there's 2 versions of this, one which is yeasted and one which is not. I'm not sure if these recipes are on my website or not. To be perfectly honest, I can't remember if I have posted these online or not. It is something I make almost every year in the monastery, though. And lots of recipes are out there for these 2 kinds of Stollen. It's a German tradition. Now, this is the last kind of special thing for the Christmas holiday. This is called Bolo Re. Actually, in the Portuguese dialect, it's buhe. But it's a yeasted dough that is made in the shape of a ring that is supposed to suggest the crown of the three kings. Okay, so it's served with Epiphany. And on the inside, very often, as you do with a king cake, this is a yeasted version of a king cake. As with a king cake, there's a bean on the inside. And the person who gets the bean is the one who is the lord of the feast for the day. Okay. And this eventually evolved into those horrible purple, yellow, green cakes with too much sugar and a baby Jesus inside. That whole tradition creeps me out a little bit. I think this is a little nicer. Sometimes people will wrap up a coin in a piece of parchment paper and put it in there also as a way of the person who gets the slice with the coin gets some good luck as well. Okay. When you start with your dough, and again, it's one of those doughs that uses dried fruits on the inside and apricots, and I like to make it with apricots and almonds. You put, it's a fairly soft dough, and you dust your fingers with flour, and you push them into the center of the dough, and then gradually, little by little, start to roll it outwards and spread it outwards gently. You got to be very careful with it until you get a ring, okay? And then it rises, and you bake it and so forth. Sometimes you can use, I have an actual baking form that makes a ring like that. It's stoneware. I don't know quite where, I got it at a garage sale, so I'm not sure who makes it. But you can find things that make like a sort of wreath-like thing that you can put your dough into as well if you want something that's perfectly even. But I kind of like the more rustic look here. And then you, I like to put, there's lots of different ways to put things on the top of it. I like to use orange marmalade and apricot preserves with a little bit of orange juice, and I heat that up on the stove and then pour that over the top and then decorate it with the toasted almonds and the candied cherries to look like gems. The recipe you see on the right-hand side is for a different version of king cake. That recipe is online, and it has, it's a sour cream cake that is flavored with dark chocolate, orange rind and orange juice, and almond extract. And it is one of the most delicious cakes I've ever had in my life. And one of the things I like about it is, I don't know if this happens to you, this happens at my house occasionally, is that somebody gets a box of candy and then we don't put it out, or it kind of sits on a shelf, or the abbot keeps it in his office and he forgets to put it out. And then we have candy that's just a little bit stale. You can chop up an old chocolate like that and drop it in with this orange and the almond flavor, and it kind of renews it, and you haven't wasted that nice chocolate, and you get a good cake out of it. And that is literally exactly what I did today. Today we had a box of chocolates that had gone a little bit stale. I chopped them up and dropped them into this recipe, and so we're going to get an orange chocolate cake for supper. As I said, monks are spoiled. So that is the end of the PowerPoint. Does anybody have a question about any of these recipes? This person says, I find the ads more annoying. Yes, the ads are annoying. I am really tired of having to click on an X box to make the ads go away. I agree. Does it matter if the donuts are hot when you fill them? Do not fill them when they're hot. You can fill them when they're warm, but don't fill the donuts when they're hot. You can let them cool down until they're just warm, slightly warm to the touch, but I would not put them in when they're hot. That would be problematic. How will the recipes be coming? I will be sending Judith a document by email that will have the links to all these various places, and then she will email that to you since you have signed up for this with your email. Okay. Can you use the slab braid for challah? I do it all the time. Challah is better. I mean, challah really is supposed to be 6 strands, 2 lobes of 6 strands, so that you have like the 12 tribes. I mean, that's really what you're supposed to do. That's a lot of work, and sometimes you're in a hurry. I get it. So slab braids works beautifully for a challah loaf. And you know what? You put a little sesame seed over the top of that, and it looks like it came straight out of a bakery. And they're gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. So yeah, I recommend you try this. if you've ever done challah before, or the problem you have with challah is that your braids don't look nice, this is one way to make that work. Can you 6 braid from the slab? I suspect so, although I've never tried it. You'd have to make your slab a little wider to make that happen, I suspect. But I bet you could do a 6 braid from the slab. That particular method, if you've ever done a 6 braid before, is that you take the one on the far right-hand side, you go over 2, under 1, over 2, under 1, and then shift it, and then one on the right becomes the next one, and then you do the opposite of that, and that's how the braid works for that. I suspect that method would probably still work. It'd be worth experimenting. I can't imagine. One of the nice things about bread is that if it doesn't look pretty, it's still going to taste good. And if nothing else, you'll get croutons or French toast. So I recommend giving it a try. Anybody else with another question about baking?
I think Linda Spitzer, do you want to unmute and ask your question? Go ahead, Linda.
I was clapping. I didn't have a question. I wasn't raising my hand. I was clapping. I was saying thank you very much.
Oh, good. Excellent.
Thank you.
I've experimented with filling challah, it says here. I've experimented with filling challah with fruit, and sometimes works and sometimes too wet. Do you have any advice on filling challah, either braided or in roll form? Okay, dried fruits work okay in challah. If you're going to use a filling that would be like, let's say you wanted to make something for Rosh Hashanah, and you wanted a filling that was going to be made with apples and honey, okay? You don't want to use apple pie filling. You want to use fresh chopped apples and a little bit of honey. And then you can actually roll so you're going to make a crown braid for Rosh Hashanah. You roll your dough kind of flat. You put your apples and your honey in there, and more apple than honey. And then you roll it up carefully and seal it. And then you can use it that way. But a lot of times a fruit filling in challah, you're right, is absolutely too wet. You might be able to get away with that with a babka, but and in fact, I have seen some cranberry babka before for Thanksgiving. But I have a suspicion that you're right, that a lot of times things are a little too wet to do that. Dried fruits work better for that sort of thing in a challah. But I have seen Rosh Hashanah recipes that use the apples and honey filling, but it's got to be fresh chopped apples, not apple pie filling, because that's just too wet. Thank you for the presentation, etc. Any other questions? I'd be happy to answer them because I have much knowledge.
Thank you so very much. This was very, very informative. And
I hope you found it interesting and that you're hungry. That's the main thing.
Well, the pictures on the screen, I could just reach in and grab some of those. They look so good.
Well, I will, as I said, I will send you a document very shortly. I will put the information about the St. Nicholas Center and the Spekulas cookies on there too. I'll put that link on there so that people can find that. So that if you want to decide to do something, the spice cookies, even if you just make them as round cutouts, they're so good. They're just so good. It's my favorite spice cookie ever. So I will be sending those out. Let's see here. Anybody with any advice on substitution of packet yeast instead of from a jar? That is such a good question, Rhiannon K, wherever you are. Here's the thing. A package of yeast holds 2 1/4 teaspoons of yeast. That's the exact amount. 2 1/4 teaspoons in a package of yeast, 7 grams essentially. They actually make spoons that will take 2 1/4 teaspoons of yeast out of a bag or a jar, because that's a measurement that a lot of recipes are for. But here's the rule of thumb for any yeasted dough recipe that's not too sweet or too heavy. 1 package of yeast equals 4 cups of flour. That's the basic rule of thumb. 1 package of yeast for every 4 cups of flour in a recipe. So if you have a recipe that uses, say, 5.5 to 6 cups of flour, you probably want to use 2 packages of yeast to make sure that it has enough lifting power. It will rise eventually if you only use a single package of yeast, but it will take much longer. The general rule of thumb that manufacturers tell us, 1 package of yeast for every 4 cups of flour. That way, let's suppose you've got your grandma's recipe that uses fresh cake yeast and it says 1 fresh cake of yeast, and you're like, how do I translate that into active dry yeast? 4 cups of flour, 1 package of yeast. 1 package of yeast is 2 1/4 teaspoons. That's how you measure that out. Okay. Active yeast and rapid rise. How to substitute one for the other. Okay. Rapid rise yeast is exactly the same as regular yeast in smaller particles with some vitamin C added to give an extra boost to the yeast. So those two are the exact same species of yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae. It's the exact same species of yeast that work the exact same way. It's just that they're in a smaller particle that dissolves faster and has a little bit of vitamin C added. So if you have a recipe that calls for active dry yeast and what you have is rapid rise, throw it in. It'll work great. However, if you have a recipe that calls specifically for rapid rise yeast, you probably need to use rapid rise yeast for that recipe to work because it's going to be a slightly different method. So rapid rise can substitute for active dry, but not the other way around. Okay, so active dry is the exact same species, like I said, and then the rapid rise yeast works just fine for an active dry, the traditional recipe as it were. But the rapid rise recipes usually have a slightly different method that are specific to that particular product. So it's better if it's this recipe calls for rapid rise, you're better off using it, or else you may find yourself frustrated.
We have one more question. When using dry packaged yeast, do you want to proof all the way to foam before adding?
You know, there's various ideas on this. Okay, a lot of recipes call for you to proof the yeast in a little bit of water. Sometimes a 1/4 cup of water with a little, like a pinch of sugar. Okay, and that is a good idea if you're worried that your yeast isn't going to work, or if you've got a recipe that's got a lot of sugar or eggs and you want to give your yeast an extra boost, to kind of get a head start. Okay. Most recipes, it's not really that necessary anymore. Sometimes, like for challah, you're going to mix your yeast, your flour, your water, some of your flour and your water, and you're going to make like a little starter sponge that goes for about 20 minutes to a half an hour, and then add the rest of your ingredients. You need that because challah's got so much egg in it that it's harder to get it to lift. You're going to get a much better flavor with that. So as a general rule, if the recipe calls for you to proof it ahead of time, I generally do. Okay, I really feel that that's better because sometimes the recipe is such that it's designed to assist in the rising in a bread that is either got a lot of sugar in it, or extra eggs, or extra butter, and it just needs a little advance boost to get started. I myself a lot of times will use instant yeast, which that's a whole nother method altogether, and that's fairly reliable. I don't do a lot of proofing for everyday bread simply because I go through my yeast so quickly it doesn't have a chance to spoil. I mean, there's no chance that it's expired by the time I get to it. But if a recipe calls for proofing, generally it probably means that you should do so. It's only adds maybe 10-15 minutes to the recipe. I think it's worthwhile. You get a better result. Okay. Yes, these are old family recipes, this person. Yes, then especially for an older recipe, that may be intrinsic to the recipe itself. But as a general rule, modern yeast is more reliable than these older forms of active dry yeast. These recipes that are from the 40s and 50s and even early 60s, some of those, it's because the product wasn't as reliable as it is today. Today they're very straightforward. The fact that it has an expiration date on it helps a lot. Okay. Good questions. I love old family recipes. I can't tell you how many of the recipes are in my cookbooks that started out on, a recipe card that was written in fountain pen by my grandma, that kind of thing. So that always makes me very happy when people are using older recipes.
Well, thank you so very much, Father Dom. And we'll be looking forward to your email to me, and I'll forward to everyone. And
I will send it very shortly. I will, as soon as I get off here, I will go on, add that additional material on there and anything else I can think of. And I'll email it straight to you. And then we can make sure that I'll probably copy you, Stephen, as well. And make sure that that gets out to everybody. So you can start a little extra holiday baking, whatever holiday you decide to celebrate.
Stephen, did you have anything else you wanted to say?
Just to add my thanks, Father, and to wish you a very blessed and Merry Christmas. And thank you so much for coming to be with us today.
My pleasure. I'm glad I could join you. Okay.
Thank you so much.
God bless everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Judith, I'm going to stay on for a little bit, okay?
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm looking up that email or that document. Grand lecture notes. PowerPoint. Oh, here we go. There it is. Okay, Bake Your Way links. Okay. So the St. Nicholas thing, was that one of the things I said I was going to give them, right?
Yeah.
Let me find that page. Okay. There's that link. I'll add it to. Yeah, I'm making those this weekend for sure. They're my absolute favorite spice cookie.
Cookies you're talking about?
Yeah, the spice cookie. They're just so good.
That sounds like something I will do. I like to do different things. Have you ever heard of krustakis?
Sure. Oh yeah. Yeah, those little angel wings things. Yeah. I have that recipe too.
Polish background, and that was one of the Christmas things that my grandmother would always make. And
did she cut them as like a little triangle and you kind of slit and pull it through? Yeah. See, that's the traditional shape for the little angel wings. Yeah, I love that. I love that recipe. Those are so good.
They were so light, and it almost, that she would make them, and they were so light and airy, and then, filled with the touch the powdered sugar on the top, and
just the little powdered sugar. It was like an angel's wing. It really was. Oh my gosh.
My grandmother was a bread baker, and she made this raisin bread, and we would, and again, she was from Poland, so she had the accent and everything, but she tried to teach me, and I would ask her, well, what, how much of this or how much of that? She'd say, Judith, this much.
Yeah.
This much.
Yeah. How many nuts? Well, enough,
I said, your hand is a different size than mine.
Yeah. The other thing I would get on occasion would be like, well, Grandma, how many nuts do you put in there? Well, I usually use pound, unless nuts are high. Like if the nuts were expensive that week, she wouldn't use so many. It's like, okay, yeah, whatever. All right, so right on here, I have the link to breadmonk.com, and they can click on the recipes in the navigation bar. I have a link to Tori Avi's Sufganiyot recipe. I have the link to my blog on St. Nicholas, including the St. Nicholas cookies, and then the website stnicholascenter.org for ideas to celebrate St. Nicholas's feast day from around the world. Then a link to my Facebook page, my Pinterest page, and then the cookbooks on Monk's Market. So anything else you can think of I should need to put on there?
I think that's pretty much it, but you know, once we start sending that out, and if anybody asks me anything, I can email you and
Yeah,
touch base and
if there's
say,
some of the recipe that I've left out or forgotten, then I'll,
or if they have a question once they start making something, maybe they.
yeah, sometimes when you're getting underway and it's like, oh my gosh, can I substitute this and such,
Yeah, okay.
understand how it goes. All right, now let me go to my email and make sure I have an email address for you that's accurate. New message. Okay, so what's your email?
It's J Oliver at covenantplacestl.org.
Ah, there it is. Okay. Links. See attached. I'm just going to do this right now just to make sure that you get it. How's this computer? It is astonishing how much I rely on this computer instead of my memory.
I hear you.
When I look at okay, so I'm sending this right now. Oh, wait, I should get a copy to, what about Stevens? Do I have Stevens?
It's S, yeah, you should, but it's S Cohen, SCOH.
There it is. Okay. So I have sent it now. If you want to check and make sure you got it.
Not yet.
So the document is an attachment.
Okay. I haven't gotten any new emails in. Let me do a refresh and see.
It told me that it's on its way.
Got it.
Okay, great.
I need to do a refresh on my end. So yeah.
Okay.
Yep, I got it. Thank
All
you,
right,
Wayne.
super.
Got it. Thank you.
Works out beautifully.
Much appreciation. It was very, very, very good.
I hope that you enjoyed it. I enjoyed doing it very much, and I love the fact that people had what I thought were really outstanding questions. Really, they were all super. So
Yeah.
I liked it. The engagement was good. People seemed to enjoy themselves. I think people seem to like the braid thing, like the easier way to make a braid. As soon as I said something about that it's hard to roll the braids out, I had some of the people I could see on the right-hand side of my screen, and I had some people like, like that's exactly the problem they have. So that worked out beautifully. So
Yeah.
glad to share it. So I hope that, I mean, if this whole COVID isolation thing continues, please feel free to contact me, around Valentine's Day or in the middle of the winter, and we need a little something else to do a pick me up. Please feel free. I'd be happy to do another program.
Oh, that would be awesome. Oh, that'd be
I'm going to be producing these for lots of libraries are asking me to do them, civic groups that usually provide social opportunities for their clientele, especially older clientele. A lot of them are not getting out much, and they're trying to keep them engaged somehow. And so I'll be producing all kinds of these. And like I said, I've written 10 cookbooks. It's not hard to put together a PowerPoint.
okay.
I'm going to have hundreds and hundreds of photos of all kinds of recipes. And every time I make a new recipe, I take more pictures. So much to my publisher's delight, I might add.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. They're great pictures. Like I said, they're so, especially that sweet potato bread. All of them actually. You wanted to reach onto the screen and grab them.
Well, because the sweet potato bread was sliced and had the butter, it looked like I could just have a slice right now. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Good.
Absolutely. I have a bunch of sweet potatoes at home. I think I might have to try that right away.
You know what? You just, cook them up, mash them up, and it's a cup. It's a cup where there's like one potato basically. But boy, is it yummy. It's really good.
It
So,
looks really good.
Judith, keep in touch.
Okay, thank you so much.
All
Thank
right,
you so much.
God
Appreciate
bless.
it. Bye.